Okay, here we go. We are back. All right, sorry about that.
All right, let me
Let's make sure get chat back in here because I don't have any viewers, so it's probably started a new deal here. Here we go. There's Bacon. Did I lose chat?
All right.
There you are. Okay. All right, we'll give it a second. Let everybody get back over here. I got a disconnect notice from Streamlabs, and then that's when it all got sideways. So give you guys a second to file back in here, and we'll let Toasty kind of start over. I'm sorry to do that to you.
That's okay.
Take two. Okay, mute the phone. Going nuts here.
Yep.
All right. I sent the link into Twitch in case anybody wants to come back. Okay. Everybody, we are so sorry. Streamlabs decided to get off on a very slow foot this afternoon.
We lost the bot, apparently.
Yeah.
You still there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm still here.
All right.
Want to continue now?
All right. So I think we got this thing all straightened out. Let's continue.
Okay. So very briefly, I'll just go over what I was talking about. So to start your journey through the timeline of the Long Dark, you got to start with the historical events that happened in real life and in the game. So we have the 2 World Wars and the Cold War, and that kind of builds up eventually, leading into later events that help build visually what the Long Dark looks like, at least on Great Bear Island. So yeah, it all starts with the events at Spence's farms homestead with the demon bear. That is the earliest entry in the timeline. And then we have like the founding of Milton. That's the earliest town that is confirmed to be founded in the Long Dark. And then there's Thompson's Crossing right after World War II. And then there's a period where part of it is speculation on me and part of it is confirmed in the game, where these big construction projects and locations are being built. Blackrock is built about 100 years before the game, before Wintermute starts. And then after that, I did a video a while ago that I did some research about places like the airfield and where the Langston mine, when the Langston mine would have built, and like when uranium would have been a mining focus. So places like Field 31 historically would have been built before World War II, and then due to what we know about the far territory, we can just speculate that the Langston mine was probably built in this time period. We know that the railway that cuts through Great Bear was also built in the 30s, at least maybe started earlier, but it cut through Mystery Lake in the 30s. So yeah, there's a lot of big things happening post World War I that helps build up these bigger locations. Following the first or the 2 World Wars, we have the Cold War era, which is when likely the Langston mine switched to uranium. And yeah, these are just like historical, facts from real life that help put into context when things might have happened in the Long Dark, because the game does follow history relatively closely up until a certain point. And we'll talk about that later. Then we get to the fun stuff, the parts where I think the lore is really interesting. Anyone? Do we have any comments
So
any questions?
Pyro is asking, wasn't the Langston mine a coal mine at first?
Yeah, it starts as a coal mine. So I'm estimating the Langston mine to probably start construction in the late 20s and 30s, because that's when the railroad is being built. And the railroad leads directly to the Langston mine. So I think that's a good estimate. So it starts as a coal mine, and then we find a note later in the zone of contamination that says that they switched to uranium mining. So that likely happened in the 50s. So there's a period where it's one and then the other. And then, of course, it would shut down eventually. But yeah. And anything else in the chat? Any more comments before I move on? Because I think we're going to get into some juicy lore.
Yeah, so I'll be the one who's just saying, hard to believe if my ex showed up for me to fly us into a blizzard with no question asked. Not happening. LOL. I can't blame you for that.
That's
I'll be
funny.
the one. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can get into that eventually if we want to.
Yeah. And Faye is saying, to be fair, the blizzard hadn't started when she asked.
Yeah, I think it was starting up.
Yeah.
Nor the flare.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. She couldn't have known. Definitely not.
No.
All right. So this is where in the past, as I've done the videos and established my own timeline, I've gotten this part wrong about Carter Dam. And I think it's partially to do to the wiki being a little iffy on the details, because I believe it has Predux lore, which I don't consider canon. So Carter was constructed in the 60s, in the early 60s. And in the late 60s, it was abandoned due to, not abandoned, but partially closed due to earthquakes and the price of coal dropping. And actually bankrupted the creator of Carter, Richard Carter. And the seismic activities is like a running thing in the history of the game, specifically the first game. It might not be a thing in the second game in Black Frost, because it is tied to Great Bear Island. It is part of the geology of the location. And it is the reason why over time and in the lore, there are many instances where seismic activity is referenced as the reason for the decline of the island. And so Carter gets hit pretty hard, which is interesting because not even a decade later, the Black Rock power plant is completed, which is also a hydro dam, but I guess they had more luck. Which is really cool, but also, like what is, I don't know, a decade of time. What's the difference there? It's interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of curious to think about why, the one in Blackrock was successful.
It is smaller.
It is smaller. That was what I was just about to say. It's a smaller dam, so it's probably maybe more manageable.
And I think it only really powers Blackrock, the prison. I'm not sure if it powers other parts of the island.
Yeah.
And then we get
just Blackrock and the surrounding, structures.
And then we get to the 80s. The 80s is when a lot of stuff happens. A lot of very important events in the pre-game history. Some of it I won't talk about because spoilers for the Tales trilogy. I don't want to go over that because that's relatively new. And we won't we're probably going to spoil Wintermute, but like that's, older. But we start with this is I think I was mistaken on this before. I believed it was supposed to be originally I believed it was the Milton economic boom period, but that was actually not true. Looking back, the lore tells us it is Great Bear Island's boom period in the 80s. This is when Milton reaches its maximum population. I believe it's in this period, but it's the max population of 1,000 people, which is crazy. And it's important to note that in-game Milton may not reflect in-lore Milton, and that's the case for everything. Because Milton doesn't even look like it could house 100 people. And at the time of the game, it's only a few dozen or less, I believe.
Yeah, you think you would expect to see like more abandoned structures and stuff like that.
Yeah. Or just complete like areas where there clearly was a building there at one point and it was just deconstructed over time. So yeah, the 80s is a huge moment in the history of Great Bear Island specifically. Carter Dam also has a revival project started where they're trying to modernize the dam, and we even see some really interesting lore with revolving around Carter Dam in the buffer memories, and also some notes in Wintermute to give context to what happens to Carter Dam. And then this is where I entered the speculation part for the 80s, because this is not confirmed, but I believe, and we're leading into the Tales section, the Langston mine would have closed before the Tales started, because we know it is vital to Rudiger's project. And then the project would start shortly after. And that would probably, I believe it leads into 1983, because there's a note in the game. If you want to look for it, it's in the airfield that kind of maybe suggests it was late 1982 and then maybe leads into 1983, according to some other notes. Who knows? But that's the rough period of when the Tales are happening. And this is all in the dark. It's all underground. It's secretive. If you haven't played the Tales, please do, because it is, I feel like it's the peak of narrative content in the Long Dark. And I'm hoping that they can carry that over into episode 5. You mind if I look at the chat here for a second?
Yeah,
no, go ahead. I was answering one question from somebody who was asking, Creeper the Drone was asking any news of episode 5 or a recent dev diary, and
that was
the
what I was
answer
going to
is
ask.
no news on episode 5, and dev diary is coming soon, according to Raphael.
Yeah, and if anyone has questions or theories they want to bring up about the lore, please drop them in the chat. I just want to make sure we can get to the chat every so often. So if you want to interrupt, if there's a good question, let me know.
Yeah, I've been watching that pretty closely.
So yeah, the 80s is a big period of time, like a very important period of time for Great Bear. And then something kind of tragic happens at the very end of the 80s. The Great Bear Highway is complete, but it's only really a tragedy for one place, and it's our very favorite mountain town, Milton. So this triggers Milton's economic collapse. And it's told in one specific note, and I have it here, I believe. The town of Milton, though, it is such an important piece of like lore in the game, because it gives us context for what happened to Milton. And it tells us about a place that I feel like a lot of us would love to see in the Long Dark, but I don't think we're going to. It is Port Mary. And Port Mary is, based on this one note, is, it tells us that it sounds like Port Mary is very important. And it makes sense. The name suggests it is a port of some kind. I speculate it's probably just a pretty big town, like a port with a lot of, the bigger population there. And why Milton was so important was because it was a pit stop for Port Mary and people that were going to go work in the mountains. I don't know the rough location of where they were going, but we know there's one road that goes through Milton. So that road leads to where they were going to go to work.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Pyro is asking, sorry, the Tales going to have anything to do with Wintermute?
Yes.
Yes.
The roadmap has always said that. They've never changed it, so we can confirm it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. And Volcano is saying there's lots of similarities between Mills disease and the Langston mine outbreak.
Yeah. Pyro's question from earlier may or may not be related to that. Yeah. There's some similarities there. It's very intentional, for sure. But
go ahead.
No, it's fine.
No, I was just going to say, that's, you were talking about playing the game, and maybe we can circle around back to this and stuff. When I first started playing it and playing the game confused me, and I didn't realize the layers of history because of the way it's presented in the game. And so, like, you know, we were talking about this earlier, with the fact that there's a disconnect. There's this weird feeling of time dilation when you first play when you first play Wintermute. And I think what you're describing and all these things are the things that get lost in all that. So this discussion, I think, I'm hoping will everybody who listens to it and who hasn't played Wintermute to go back in and play it with a more open mind of looking for the information to fill out the story, which will help open up some of this confusion and time dilation thing that a lot of people talk about.
Yeah. Rounding off on Milton. So when that highway was constructed, that's when things went downhill, because people were no longer driving through Milton, which would drive the economy. And that would lead to what we see in game is a complete ghost town, which is very sad to see. In lore, Milton seemed like a really, interesting place in the 80s, and in game,
Milton was the only place that had a post office. It was the only place that had a bank. So it was kind of the hub of the island.
It had its own gas station. It had its own park.
Yeah, well, I can imagine.
Radio tower too.
Yeah, if a lot of people are traveling, across the island for like work or whatever, and they have to go through Milton or even stopping there for tourist activities, they would have more demand for those kind of things over other regions.
And this goes to the modern day interstate system that we, know and use, today. There were a lot of small towns that were, a part of the highway system. Then they moved the interstate, several miles away, and these towns started to dry up because they weren't getting tourists. They weren't getting people to come through there. And it's kind of a similar thing there. So once they built the coastal highway, nobody's going through Milton. There's not much in the way of work. People are they're going to move away. They can't sustain themselves.
Creeper the Drone has a good question. When was the coastal highway region abandoned? It seems to be recently abandoned. Also, why are the cars in the far territory when they can't get to the main parts of the island? Two questions, actually. The first one, I wouldn't say the coastal highway region looks abandoned. I would say the whole island looks like that in a few different ways. There's locations that have clearly been abandoned for a long time, maybe a decade, maybe a few decades. But I don't believe any particular region was fully abandoned by the time of Wintermute or survival mode. It just looks that way because the island is in shambles. So there are many buildings that are being ripped apart for resources. They were burnt down because of the first flare, because of the electrical fires. Just buildings going and being in disrepair because they haven't been touched in a long time. The place is very much, falling apart. And the other question, the cars, how did they get there? There's a couple explanations for it. In game, there are some trucks that have like railway tires or wheels, I guess, attached to them. So they can travel along the railroad and then get off of the railroad at Transfer Pass and then get on the road. Other vehicles, I don't know how they would get there normally, but there is a road that leads to somewhere in the Sundered Pass, but we don't know if it actually kept going. It seems to be like blocked by, I think, an avalanche.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's possible they could have been brought there and assembled there, but I don't know if that would be the case.
And then here's another excuse for what you're talking about with Port Mary, and the whole island had to be established from a starting point, so there had to be a jump off point, and Port Mary would make sense for that because you've got to have some place to unload the ships, unload the supplies, and it wouldn't have happened overnight. It would have been attrition. So a lot of these cars and things would have trickled through. And another thought process too with how these cars are getting around, and this is something we see here in the United States in our national forests. There are things called forest roads that are very
Mhm.
they're not very well maintained, but they are like little dirt roads that you can get to places. There may be a lot of these that we're just not seeing because they're covered in snow. They've been,
Mhm.
Yeah.
washed away
Yeah.
from rain or whatever, the the earthquake. So there may be some hidden things that are infrastructure in a sense that aren't showing up in the game for certain reasons. I mean, some of even the roads that are like the road that leads from Pleasant Valley up to Signal Hill, it's just ruts in the road. So
Yeah.
got enough snow you wouldn't even tell it was there.
Yeah. There's a few more questions
Yeah,
here.
let's go over the questions.
I'll be the one. Toasty, thank you for your work. Appreciate it. When did you start playing the Long Dark? What was your first death? I don't remember my first death, but I believe I started playing when the game first launched. But I don't know when I actually played first. I bought it when it first launched.
And then Faye is asking, why are there no corpses in the cars? And I think that has to do with just typical when you're dealing with a catastrophic event, you're in panic mode. So when the cars stopped working, people got out of their cars, and that's maybe where some of the bodies are, strewn throughout the island and what have you. People didn't survive. So
yeah, like I believe Point of Disagreement is one of those places where there's a few cars and then some corpses. That's probably due to an altercation of some kind.
And then the other thing we have to remember too, and Toasty could probably back us up on this deal, is some of the stuff we see visually, and this happens even with the game, like the infinite number of bottles of water and tea, is that they have to represent the game in a certain way. And, putting models together are expensive. And so that's why all the cars look very similar. And to put a body inside the car might have been something that was just too expensive, or might have been something that was causing crashes or something. So
Or
some of those
bugs
things
or
may
something.
some of these things may be, may have been originally in the game and then taken out due to issues. So you can't get too, much tied into some of that stuff, because sometimes decisions are made financially or, logistically when they're putting these games together.
Yeah, I mean, I would almost say too, like you'd almost have to change the code on that one specific car if you have a corpse in it, because like all the other cars, they're kind of default where you can open all the doors. So, you open the door and you get into one that has a corpse, you might get stuck or something like that. So, yeah, I could see that being pretty intensive to try and actually do.
And being an independent game company with a limited income, early on, they're going to make shortcuts, and the cars, all the cars and trucks look the same. And that's just an easy way to, duplicate and shortcut, and still looks real, but that's how you save money.
We can certainly see in the Black Frost announcement, they have put quite a bit of work into variety for everything.
Yes.
Vehicles, signs, buildings. There's a lot of new stuff, which is nice.
More investment in it. So, yeah.
And it makes sense from a lore standpoint because we're on the mainland and there are more resources. There's just a lot more available to work with. If that's what if Great Bear Island looked like what Harmont looks like, it wouldn't make sense lore-wise.
Yeah.
But the vehicles we do see, the technology we do see, it does make sense. Even though some of it is dated. And I would be really concerned if there were a lot of dead bodies in cars, because then I would think there's a zombie outbreak or something. Like, I don't want to touch it. It might start moving.
Yeah.
But it is frozen, so yeah.
And Creeper the Drone is asking also the tail end on Timberwolf Mountain. Where's the rest of the plane?
That's a question for Hinterland. I have no idea.
Yeah, I would say having it be at the bottom of Crystal Lake probably makes the most sense.
That's a good headcanon. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
And we don't know when that crashed, because there's that note in the cabin, the Mountaineer's hut, that lists the dates in September. And Wintermute starts in November, because there's a note that tells us specifically November. It was at the bus crash in Milton. So maybe that plane crashed in September and part of it landed in the lake and then it froze. I don't know.
That's possible. Yeah, that makes
it's possible.
That's as good as lore as anything.
And I don't remember if that one mentioned anything about auroras. But yeah, that would actually canonize that now, because I don't believe that note is canon anymore because of the date on it. But it could be that it's way before the first flare.
Also, hello, Humble. Welcome. And Pyro is saying, I had a question above that I think you missed. Were you talking about Wintermute? We touched on it really quickly.
Yeah, we'll be going through Wintermute eventually.
Yeah. Yeah, so...
the tail's connected to Wintermute.
Yeah, so the short answer, Pyro, is yes, but we're going to cover that a little bit later.
Yeah, we won't cover the connection, but it is confirmed that the tails will connect to Wintermute. And yeah, this note from Mountain Timberwolf Mountain at the hut does not say anything about an aurora. So this could still be canon. This could be the reason why part of the plane is missing. It might have just fallen in the lake, but we don't know.
Yep. Yeah, and Bumblebee over on Twitch is saying people tend to leave shelter when they have hypothermia. So that would make sense why you don't see people in vehicles anyways, because you start to feel a little warmer and you head out. So,
and it's like they always say, panic kills. So you're in that situation. That's the difference between the people that survive and the people that don't survive. Generally, are the ones who can control panic. So obviously nobody survived.
Pyro is saying we still missed his question. The only other one I see from you, Pyro, is about the Langston mine, asking if it was a coal mine first. And yeah, it was a coal mine first.
But by all means, just copy and paste it and put it back in there and we'll answer it.
Yep. If that's not it either, those are the only two I see.
Let me quickly finish up here the last few events before we get into like the collapse in Wintermute.
No problem.
So then we get into the 90s and the 2000s. So the 90s would mark the end of Carter Dam. Like Carter Dam is shut down at this point, and that's due to the Forest Talkers. This is actually, I think, the earliest entry in the Forest Talkers history. They go into Carter, they take hostages, they demand it to get shut down. I don't know what happened, how they convinced them to do it, but there is a note that tells us the CEO of the company at the time was just concerned about, continued eco activism, and I'm guessing the project just wasn't getting off the ground because it seemed like that it was just doomed to fail. So yeah, Carter closes in the 90s, which makes me concerned what exactly Will gave Jeremiah in Wintermute and how old those medicines were.
Oh yeah.
Those are about 30 years old. No big deal.
Yeah, because antibiotics have a shelf life. So
yeah. It seems to have done the trick though, somehow. And then we have one entry here from another one from the Tales, related to the Tales, but it's not about the project itself, about the unknown adventurer that discovers the remnants of Rudiger's project, and they leave behind two different notes. And those are in 1991. So prior to us, there was another person that went in and found what was left of Rudiger's project. And you can find those notes in the Far Territory. And then this is pure speculation, and actually I don't have a concrete date for it, but Field 31 would eventually shut down, and it either happened around the time of Rudiger's project or the 2000s. I'm not entirely sure when. It's a long period of time, but there is a note that suggests the road closing that leads out of the airfield because of the collapse, like the part that is collapsed in game. And I really can't pinpoint if that note is more recent or if it's from the time of Rudiger's project, maybe even related to the people that were involved. So the airfield would shut down at some point before the game. And it could be in any of those periods of time in the 80s to 2000s. But for certain, I do know that the train station would stop operating at the Far Territory in the 2000s because of the board outside of the depot shows like the dates and the schedule, and it would show the year 2000, and then there's like an empty space where they would normally mark 2001, 2012, whatever. So we know that the train station there would close in the 2000s, and that's about it until you get to the collapse, which is a whole can of worms. A lot of very important context there for the state of Great Bear Island. And this is after the decline of the island started. This is where I do got to mention how important it is to distinguish between Great Bear Island's collapse and the collapse. The word collapse is used a lot in the game for various different things. But there's two different collapses going on, mostly related to the location that we're on, which is Great Bear Island, and the game in general, the history of the world. So Great Bear Island has its economic peak in the 80s, and it would slowly, gradually collapse over time through the 90s and 2000s. The collapse, which actually is a slow, gradual event as well, starts, according to the lore, in the mid 2000s and potentially leads up to 2012. There are a few notes that suggest it's 2012 based on what we find in Wintermute in episode 1, specifically Milton. So that's where I believe it kind of kicks off. Like, this is it. The collapse is here. Everything's kind of going to, it's hitting the fan.
Yeah.
And the collapse is a global event versus Great Bear Island's collapse being local. And what happens from the effects of the collapse mostly affect North America. So that includes Canada. So we're seeing, economic crises across the world, political instability, volatile markets, and banking systems collapsing. And this actually mirrors the real life recession we saw in the late 2000s, the 2009 recession. But this is like worst case scenario. It is much worse. And so Canada is in a really bad spot, and at some point needs to essentially become kind of like a partner to the US, but for economics specifically. The world has shifted over to Chinese currency and cryptocurrency, which is crazy to think that this is referenced in the game. And this was written 2015, probably 2016, and they're talking about cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, that's crazy.
We also see like drones and electric vehicles mentioned as well. So it's maybe not so far-fetched.
We do have some questions in chat as well, real quick. So Pyro was saying his other question was, what exactly was the Langston mine outbreak? A virus, disease, radiation?
It is not a virus. It is not a bacteria. It is not radiation. Well, it is radiation as in, energy, not radiation as in radioactive.
Yeah.
It is a condition. Maybe there's a more proper term for it. Disease would also work, but it's not viral or bacterial. I would say condition.
It was a side effect, correct?
Side effect.
Is that a...
Maybe. I would say condition.
A condition. Okay.
I'm not very versed in biology or human chemistry or diseases in general, but the way I see it, without going too much into details on what happened there, because we don't want to go over Tales trilogy too much.
Yeah.
I believe it's very similar to how diabetes would work. There's kind of like a trigger that happens, and all of a sudden your body starts, behaving differently, and it seemingly can't be reversed, because once you've hit that point where you are exposed to a certain thing, your body just reacts differently to everything.
Maybe we can call it an adverse effect to an environmental exposure.
Yeah. and some of the characters even give really good like descriptions of what it feels like. It's I think that's the foreman that tells us it felt like they switched the lights off in his head, and it seems like the lights can't be turned back on. So like something triggered in the brain, and all of a sudden, you know, you have memory problems, you have sleeping problems, you find yourself maybe sleepwalking, or you know, a lot of bad things happening because you've been exposed to something for so long. So it's not a viral or bacterial thing. It's like a condition that has been triggered and it can't be reversed.
And
as far as we know,
there is a part in the story which we probably don't want to get into that kind of hints at that too.
mm-hmm.
So we'll kind of we don't want to get that far into it because there's a cutscene in the story that kind of leans into this as well.
Yep. And Volcano is asking, the forest talkers are so interesting. How'd they manage to take over the hunting lodge from their main target, Briar House?
I actually don't recall that in the lore. They took it over.
It does say something about it using it as a base of operations.
It is. It is their headquarters.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure where they would have gotten it originally from. Who originally owned it? Because to me, it sounded like a place that you could rent. Maybe they're just renting it, and it's strategically placed next to their main target after Carter.
Yeah. Who knows?
They would go
if the
on.
Owner was involved.
Mm-hmm, they would go on to fight against Briarhouse, even up to Wintermute. Like right after Wintermute starts, after the first flare, the Forest Talkers are still fighting against Briarhouse. And those are some really dedicated
who would have
employees.
The most to lose if it was the lodge owner, who would have the most to lose from them with their trains and everything? He's losing customers for them being there and ruining the environment. So that maybe he was involved, he or she.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are some dedicated employees though, going after eco activists after the world has ended.
Yeah.
And
a lot of dedicated people.
Yeah, interesting thing about that, they did note they had not been paid for a while before that happened. They were still sent out to go find the people that had stolen some documents from Briarhouse.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Guess desperate times call for desperate measures.
Yeah. Humble Tracker is saying, I find all the motion detection lights, camera, and car recharging station kind of mess with all the timelines. Yeah,
we can get to that, and that's actually it's related to the collapse for sure, for certain. It's why it seems like Great Brown's out of place in time. It's very jarring for sure. Do we have another question?
We have quite a few more.
Yeah, quite a few. We keeping up. Yeah. Bumblebee is saying that when the game, when is the game actually set? I always thought it was the early 2000s, but they keep updating it with tech.
We can get into that as well. This everything relating around the technology, the time period, it's all due to the collapse and the effects it had on Great Bear. Pyro. So then what happened when we touched the machine? How did it work without an Aurora? This is a spoiler for Buried Echoes. It's been out for a year, so I apologize. I would recommend you still play it though. It is so good. It is the best tale in the trilogy, in my opinion.
Yeah, or just mute for a moment if you don't want to.
Just mute for a minute here. When you find the machine, you go up to touch it, it triggers an unconsciousness event, or some kind of scripted event where you just fall unconscious and then you wake up and the machine is lit, and then you hear Rudiger talking. I cannot explain why you faint. I don't know why. There's no explanation for it. As far as we know, the machine is damaged beyond repair. Its effects are minimal.
Maybe it electrocuted you. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know.
Maybe there's something else going on there. I think that was just for effect.
Yeah.
Because there's a scripted time jump to... I actually don't know if it brings you to daytime or nighttime. Because the Auroras are what power the machine. and then the machine would later on release energy during the day, and that's what causes the glimmer fog. So I don't remember if it brings you to day or nighttime after you touch the machine.
Because you really don't get a sense of how long you're out.
Yeah,
and
you
so
don't
maybe
know.
what wakes you up is that recording of Rudiger doing the little speech. Yeah, so maybe that's what brings you out of your slumber / pass out.
And we know proximity is important. So yeah, Pyro makes a good point. It might be leaking radiation. It might still might have an effect on you that the closer you are, because it is noted that proximity is key for treating people that have been affected, at least in the Tales period of time. So yeah, there's no explanation for it, but it could be, it kind of makes sense. It might still have an effect on us greater than what we know of. And that's what's powering it. It's the aurora, but it seems to continue to hold its charge and release that energy later on, which is very curious considering how nothing else can do that. Nothing can hold a charge. No batteries will keep, their power, which is more related to the first flare. We won't get into that yet.
And then Volcano is saying, I assumed it was Briarhouse or associated with it because you find the Briarhouse pie recipe in it, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I believe it says no. I think it says it was stolen, but I'm not sure. I know the Forester's revolver, its flavor text says it was stolen from Briarhouse by someone. I think it might have been a Forest Talker. That's something you should definitely pay attention in the game when you pick up an item and you're inspecting it, like in game. You're not in a menu, you're like picking it up and it's in front of you. Look at the flavor text, which is the text that's like below the title, because some items have really interesting flavor text, and I actually missed very important details because of it. Like the Forester's revolver tells you it was originally Briarhouse weapon that was stolen, I believe, by the Forest Talkers. And then there's the note that you find at the beginning of Buried Echoes. It also has some flavor text that tells you the date of that note. So if you don't see the flavor text, you're missing out on something important potentially. A lot of the times it's just like it's a crumpled up piece of paper, or it's bloody or greasy piece of paper, but sometimes there's some interesting information. Yeah, like here it is. Forester's revolver, when you examine it, the flavor text says an old reliable weapon, durable, taken from a Briarhouse worker by an unknown Forest Talker, which is very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Briarhouse pie was also stolen recipe. They were definitely essentially at war with Briarhouse, the Forest Talkers.
And I would think gun theft would be a big thing because during the collapse, importing weapons and things like that would have been difficult, and expensive. So, that would have been a highly prized item, especially with the wildlife.
Let's get through just some additional details on the collapse. So, what does the collapse mean for Great Bear Island? It means that resources like food and medicine and supplies like fuel are much more difficult to get because it is reserved for the mainland. It's reserved for more densely populated areas, which I'm excited to see, like the difference between Great Bear Island and Harmont, because it is more densely populated. So like what's the difference going to be like? Are we going to see more variety in items? We're going to see more brands? We're going to see more supplies in general? I'm assuming so, because it's a co-op game. But Great Bear is so devoid of anything, depending on the difficulty you play on. It's devoid of resources and more modern technology and funding and everything. So the island is already in decline beforehand. and the collapse just makes it worse. So this is why we see what feels like an out of place, a place that is like not in like time wise. I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say here. It seems out of place in time. It seems like it could be the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s. It has
a relic feel to it.
Yeah. It's very, mixed up in terms of technology, in terms of the state of the island. So it feels like you're getting whiplash, while exploring it. Like some things are really familiar, like they're from the 2000s, but then there's like floppy disks and desktop computers that are probably 150 pounds each from the 90s. And why we're seeing things like electric vehicles mentioned in the lore, drone delivery services, Skype, solar power units, because, well, the world is really different at this point. The collapse is like the pivot point. It's so vital for the history of Great Bear Island specifically, but the world in general. It's where the Long Dark's timeline pivots from our timeline. And so, maybe technology advances in a different way where we just need to get more advanced technology out there that's as cheap as possible, but maybe it's not as reliable, which is, we were talking about this the other day. We questioned why there's electric vehicles when they could be so unreliable in wintertime. And then there's a refinery on the island, which makes you question, the existence of the electric vehicles.
Yeah.
But yeah, the collapse is kind of the reason why the island is the way it is, visually, technologically, and it kind of creates a very unique environment. You can go from Milton, where there's just houses and it's essentially a ghost town, and then you go over to Blackrock and you have a penitentiary, you have a power plant, and then you can go to Coastal Highway. You've got electric vehicle pump, and electric vehicles all over the place, and then various references to tons of different technologies from across time in the lore.
The technology being older looking, like you're saying, it's looks decades old, isn't something that's totally foreign. We're looking at this from a very privileged standpoint. I'm sure if you went to a lesser privileged country in the world, they're probably running off older computers, hand-me-downs, and things of that nature. It's not that they don't work. I mean, I have some old computer parts in the garage that I could probably build a computer that would run, Windows XP on, but it's not that it won't work. It's just it's outdated to keep up with today's technology. So there could be a lot of that going on within the game that, again, we talk about the refinery, we talk about all the things that are there. You got to have people in order to have the refinery working. There's nobody there to refine the raw fuels. There's no fuel to have. So there's as you're talking about the collapse, fewer and fewer people doing the work. They're not getting any money for doing it. There's no economy. It's just going to dissolve and fall apart. And that may be why we're seeing these hodgepodge things of older computers and that is because that's all you can afford. You're using what you can use at that point. So that may explain some of the computer issues.
Yeah, and the computers are really important for when going over the buffer memories, because you have desktops and then you have laptops. Now the laptops look pretty bulky too, but it kind of helps you estimate when those buffer memories might have been written. So anything on a computer could be from as early as the 90s or 2000s. Anything from a laptop could be from 2000s or maybe later. So it helps with kind of filling in the gaps there a little bit. Any good questions here?
Ira's been going over a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
I can't keep up with him.
It's basically of the in-game's version of the 2008-2009 economic recession. Yeah, but this is much worse for sure. I think I saw something about.
Here's one from Faye that does kind of that also could tie into this, and that is that according to her, we don't have access to the whole Great Bear Island. There are many towns and other areas, that we're not seeing. So again, you're talking about Port Mary. That place doesn't exist. There's a refinery that is mentioned that we don't know what's there, what's going on there. We haven't seen Perseverance Mills. So yeah, there are other parts of this island that aren't fleshed out completely in the game. So there's gaps.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of gaps, and I don't think they intend on filling them, which is fine. It's left up to our imaginations for sure. Pyro earlier asked, well, Great Bear Island's supposed to be a really remote location. Why do you think they built Blackrock there? I don't think it being a remote location 100 years ago is a problem. And Franklin, the warden in episode 4, he was the former warden of Blackrock, tells us it was built to house the worst of the worst. And kind of just like throwing them.
Go ahead, I'm sorry, Toasty.
It's like the place that they're throwing away the people that cannot be reintegrated into society. It's just society just getting rid of their problems. So Great Bear was kind of abused in a way in different aspects. Like, it's housing the worst criminals Canada has to offer. It's being abused, naturally. Like, it's being strip mined. It's being polluted. Everything's being chopped down and ripped out of the earth. And then come the collapse, there's no one in the world that cares about the place.
Great Bear Island was just a giant cache of minerals and supplies that was being stripped. But I was going to make a comment along with what he was saying, and why being so far away, where they use building a prison, and this is not an unprecedented thing in history. The French used to take all their prisoners to Guyana. It was a penal colony, and that's where they took their prisoners. Australia was a penal colony for the British Empire. So the fact that you would sail somebody that far away to get rid of them is not unprecedented.
Yeah.
If you think about somebody in Britain getting shipped off to Australia, that's a long journey compared to what Blackrock is. So it's not an unprecedented thing to have these things. And you could even get it political today, as you get Guantanamo Bay in Cuba is also kind of a penal colony for some of this stuff too. So it's not an unprecedented thing to build a prison that is difficult to escape, and then you make it difficult for somebody to get away from that escape. Alcatraz would be another one comes to mind. Yeah,
at this point, I think we've gone over pretty much everything pre First Flare. There's some in-game events that happen, but we don't have actual dates for them. This is the period in time where basically, the island is being abandoned by the world. There's a mass exodus going on where people are leaving for better economic opportunities. And then there's a few characters in the game that kind of they give you different ideas for why people would stay. My two favorites are Grandmother and Jeremiah. Grandmother tells us that anyone still on the island, even 10 years after the collapse, is either too proud or too poor to leave. And I think Grandmother is probably just too proud to leave. And I think there's even like a description in the lore somewhere where the people that remain on the island are the ones that are just like hardier. They are, they have deep roots to the island, so why leave if it's all they know? And then Jeremiah says anyone that would be on the island is probably hiding from something or someone, which is interesting. It makes you wonder what he's hiding from.
Yeah, because he seems to know a lot of what's going on, and especially when he's, handing off the message and there's a deeper story there for sure.
He's there for a reason, for sure. Yeah. But everyone has their reason to be there. And I think it's what makes people think everyone on the island is crazy. It's probably because they're on an island where there's nothing to do. There's barely any jobs. Everyday life is just sitting in your cabin probably and maybe reading a book or listening to the radio. It's cold as hell half the year. And the world's, hit the fan. Anyone remaining is probably a little crazy. And then there's certainly some people that are crazy, but that's probably more related to the various disease outbreaks that have occurred in the lore. And yeah, we're at this point, we're at Wintermute. We're at the first flare. Do we want to continue going through this? Would we like to answer some more questions here?
Well, I was going to say we got a couple of questions, but I'm good to go. We could maybe, or I don't know. We're coming up on an hour. I don't know if you want to like save Wintermute for another episode. I mean, I know you talked about maybe doing another visit with us. So
yeah, for sure.
It depends on how deep you want to go into today's discussion and what have you. But
yeah, we could just take some questions here for the moment. We can save Wintermute because at this point we've explained the core history of the franchise in general, the important historical events from real life as well as the events that shape Great Bear Island, such as the collapse and the construction of the highway, which affects Milton, the seismic activity, which affects the island as a whole. But yeah, just always remember the word collapse is used interchangeably in the game when describing, the state of the place of the island. We have 2 different collapses going on here, and both of them affecting Great Bear Island is probably why it looks the way it does. Seismic activities pretty much at the core of why Great Bear Island went into a decline over the years. That's why there's so many abandoned mines, because it's just too dangerous to mine them. Any questions here? Let's see.
So do you think some cars should still work during the aurora? Some still have gas.
We can talk about let's talk about some other stuff. We can talk or answer some questions like that. That's a good one. When going into the first flare, it's important to understand the science behind it. And I've made a few videos about it already. But if you look into like what an aurora is and then what causes them, you'll go like into a rabbit hole of like electromagnetism and the Carrington event, which is like the real life example of the first flare that did hit Earth in the 1850s. But fortunately we didn't have a lot going on back then, electricity wise. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting, exemptions to the whole like all electronics were destroyed aspect here. I want to say some of them are probably due to because game, which is a phrase I like to use to describe things in games that don't make sense, but it's likely needed to explain things. So, and also it could be another concept that I like to use, plot armor.
Yeah.
The reason why the main character can, climb through the castle and defeat the king's army is probably because of plot armor. It's needed for the plot. The reason why flashlights and radios work, it's because it's needed for the plot, or because game. It's more or less the same concept. That's likely the reason why those work. Vehicles kind of work in a way, but they don't drive. Like, I mean, how are you going to drive a car that's buried in snow? It's going to be impossible.
Well, yeah. Well, doesn't the fuel start to separate too? Like you get a larger water content in your engine, and then whenever you turn it on, it kind of wrecks the whole thing. So, I mean, we know some of them might be more recent, but if most of them have been sitting there for years because you can't drive anywhere because of all the earthquakes and everything collapsing, like I don't even know if you could even get it to turn over.
Yeah.
And it depends on the fuel source too. And this is where I can kind of pull from my expertise because I work in the automotive field, and that is gasoline deteriorates over time. It'll evaporate if the tanks aren't completely sealed, rubber hoses and what have you start to leak. So the fuel, we're talking about 20 years these cars might have been sitting there. The fuel will evaporate, it'll turn bad. And then with the cold too, that's the other problem. I don't know if anybody's seen a video where, like, you see like in Siberia and that, where they're taking torches just to heat up the gearboxes and stuff so that the lubricant will flow and all that stuff. So there's a lot of that going on. I would think at some point somebody could be crafty enough to maybe get like an old tractor running or something along that lines that didn't require electronics, because diesel doesn't really require an electrical spark. It doesn't require electronics. It would take time. It would need somebody to have access to the knowledge and the ability to clean all that stuff up. And again, I think one of the things that, like you were saying, because game, they don't want you to have the ability to drive around. Part of the game is you walking from point to point. If they wanted you to be able to fast travel, they would have created that. They want you to have to deal with the weather. They want you to have to deal with the wolves, the bears, the wildlife, and all the things that go on there. So putting the cars in the game ruins that. So that's part of the game. So
it's part of the design of the game.
Yeah. So some of it is part of the game. Some of it is realistic. But again, there are certain aspects that are trying to tell the story.
And going back to the first flare, what it did was, because I'm seeing it brought up a few times here in the chat, it acted like an EMP. So if you played some games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, I believe, has a scene where a nuke goes off in orbit, and that creates an electromagnetic pulse, kind of rendering all technology useless in that area. It even hits satellites in that cutscene. Think of that, but the whole world was hit by this, by essentially an electromagnetic pulse. And I actually talked to one of my friends from college who studied astrophysics, which is the study of space and stars and stuff like that. And he went over like what a real life first flare would do, and it is essentially an electromagnetic pulse that would affect anything touching the power. Well, it would affect everything, but anything connected to the power grid would basically be destroyed completely. So that's why like the power plants and all that would be completely devoid of functioning technology in a normal circumstance. Like, say we get electricity working again, nothing in the plant would work as normal because it was broken. A flashlight and a radio, some radios aren't connected to the power grid, so it kind of makes sense why they're not completely destroyed. Same with vehicles. They aren't connected to the power grid, so that's why they kind of function. But also there's a second aspect to the first flare, is that there's some kind of lingering effect going on, and then subsequent auroras generate power. They're literally generating power because that's kind of what's happening. Otherwise, there's no explanation for where all the power is, because the power plants are broken. So that kind of explains why radios and flashlights work. And I guess the Geiger counter from the Black Frost reveal trailer, that's why those are working. It's because they are still functional. They weren't affected like everything else connected to the power grid. And then there was the question by Creeper the Drone, shouldn't the Cold War era bunkers be electromagnetic proof? I believe they should, but that also could be because game. Every decision they make, even if it doesn't make sense, is there to fit the narrative or the design of the game. So we don't have fast travel because it breaks the design of the game. They want you to be slow, to actually explore the world and, witness all of the different things that you have to go through in order to survive, like the wildlife and the weather. So that's why there's no vehicles. That's why there's no sleds. That's why there's no what are they called? Snowmobiles. Even if there was electricity, the snowmobile could potentially work, but they don't have that because they don't want to change the way the game feels. They don't want to alter the design.
As far as the bunkers too, you would think like after decades of being hit with seismic activity, it would weaken their integrity as well.
Yeah.
Well, and I
So
was also going to say something to the tune that the bunkers were built by locals.
yeah, that's true.
They weren't built like by the military, so they may not have been up to military standards either.
I think they were talking about the bunkers, not the prepper caches.
Oh, okay. The ones
I still
that were,
don't know the origin of the bunkers because I don't think they were built for the tails.
Yeah, it would be a good question.
Yeah, that's still another mystery to
one of the
unanswered.
questions from earlier too was something Pyro had mentioned, was the thing about whether the Langston Mine project was either government or privately funded, and it was privately funded. That's why you have that story about the foreman who was watching over what Rudiger was doing because he was the watchdog for the company. So if it was privately built, they may not have been built to that standard. So that's a possibility. But the bunkers are weird because they don't really explain why they had all these bunkers all over the place. They were doing all this work in the mines.
Yep. And the prepper caches, we do know.
Yeah.
The origin of those. We now finally know it, which is
neat.
Neat. It is.
Faye's asking about why there isn't any baby wildlife, and I would go back to that's a deal with the game, that to make all those other animals is expensive. If you remember before the DLC, all we had were bucks, and they introduced does. So that's just an expense thing.
Yep. And both the buck and the doe is in Black Frost. It's in one of those screenshots.
So
yep.
And this one's a good one for you, Toasty, because we had talked about this, and that is Creeper Drone's asking is also no season changes even after years in the game.
Because game.
You have a You have a good reason.
That is by design. You can go through a whole year. I talked about it in a recent video in my misconception series. It's the design of the game. It's not designed to take you from season to season. That was originally part of the roadmap, apparently, for the the game before the version of the game we have now.
Yeah.
I think they eventually just decided to cut it and stick with this. And I think that it's probably the smart choice because the cold is a pillar of what makes the game the way it is, why it's so unique. And if they had summer, which actually I would welcome that. I would welcome if they made a game in summer, or even like, say, 2030, the Long Dark's getting an expansion that takes us to another part of the world, and it's summer. It's warmer there, so it's like, say, spring. It would change the game so much that it would not feel the same. It would completely, wreck everything that we know and love about the game, I think, because cold would no longer be an issue, and so then now clothing, you got to get rid of all your heavy clothing because it's overheating you.
It would have been again going back to expense. They would have had to redo all these models for each season, so every map would have had to have subsets of different color changes, different clothing.
Temperature.
Temperature. You'd have to deal with water issues. It would made the game very, very complex. But on that same note, though, with Black Frost, and I think this is where we've been getting these little teasers like the curing box and the trader and all that stuff. There's a good possibility that maybe Black Frost is going to implement these seasons, because where does the food for the horses come from? And the wildlife that aren't predators. And the fact that why would you have a curing box in this game after it's already been proven that you can just let it sit outside and rot, and level 5 cooking solves everything. So the curing box, I think, is a test for what's to come, because it's going to make you prepare for winter. You're going to have to hunker down and prepare for winter. So I'm hoping I'm right in that theory, but I think a lot of that is where it gets lost in. And I think I remember from your video where you were saying that this takes place in early November, and everybody's talking about it's really cold very early for the season, and that this is just supposed to take place over the winter.
And Black Frost is the same. It's a year later, after the first flare. So it's November, December again.
Yeah.
It temperature and weather is so, important for the feel and the experience of the game that seasons would just require too many changes. It would be like making a whole new game, and they're already doing that. I think
why not incorporate that in a new game?
Yeah. I think it would change the survival experience too much. But I would still welcome it. It'd be a fun experiment. But they're sticking with winter, and I think it's a good idea for Black Frost. Because there's a lot of tropical and non-winter survival games. There are a few, what I've noticed recently, there's a lot of clones, a lot of survival clones of the Long Dark.
Yeah.
That are coming out. They've got their demos and their release dates upcoming.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the Long Dark set, a trend within the survival game genre in the industry. We'll see. Even though it's been a while, it's been 10 years. I haven't really seen many games that do the same thing as the Long Dark. In terms of like the weather.
Yeah.
For the time of year that the survival game takes place in. In Black Frost, I want seasons and I want correct moon, stars, and sun. I'm with you, Underhill. I don't think we'll get seasons off the bat. And if we did, it would be interesting to maybe have like a season where it's not hot. I don't think it gets very hot in Canada. I'm not entirely sure. But a period where the snow starts melting and it's, more comfortable weather, basically. Which gives you an opportunity to grow some crops, grow food for your horse, do different things that you can't do in the winter and kind of prepare for the winter. That would be interesting. But I don't think we would get that right away. I agree on the sun and the moon and the stars. Because there's no functional compass, and I don't think it would work based on the effects of the first flare and what I believe might be happening with the magnetic field. I don't think a compass would work. Having a functional sun and moon cycle as well as stars would be very helpful for navigation.
Yeah, celestial navigation and using, east-west settings and all that stuff. The moon would also go back to being a calendar because of the cycles, so you'd be able to keep track of time and that. So,
and is it fire? Is it Fire Angel? Correct.
Fae
Angel.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I like the perpetual winter. The weather is the greatest foe. I agree on that. The weather is, a B word sometimes. But the perpetual winter. I want to, this is something I talked about in my recent misconceptions video. When we use the word perpetual, it can be kind of dangerous because it makes it sound like in lore, there is this perpetual winter, which there isn't. There's no evidence that there is, and there's no evidence that there isn't a perpetual winter. But in the game sense, the design sense, there is perpetual winter because that's how the game's supposed to be.
Yeah. But the game, that's survival mode that you can survive for years and years and years.
And it's always
the story. The story takes place over the winter of whatever year it is. So
there will likely be a warm season in between the games because that would allow for crops to grow, which would feed the animals. Otherwise, this would be an extinction level apocalypse where everything will slowly die off because there's no opportunity for anything to grow. So yeah, there's still summer. It's probably not the same, considering the fact that the climate is changing, even though that's not reflected in game yet.
Yeah, Jitwire and I were talking about this the other day, and I was making it sort of, it's like turning back the clock. The electronics dying, everything fell, it's like you've erased 200 years of
progress,
technological advancements, and now you're back to steam power, you're back to using coal for heating and all that stuff. So it kind of rewinds the clock. It almost is, it's similar to, like they talk about, World War III is going to be fought with nuclear weapons. World War IV is going to be sticks and stones.
Sticks and stones, yeah.
So it's like not quite back to the Stone Age, but it's
Mhm.
I would say circa 1700 Victorian, where you're using steam, you're using things like that, and I could see that kind of twisting in that universe. Not that that's going to be in Black Frost, mind you. I'll say that right now, but looking at it from a universal thing. This cataclysmic event has turned life upside down and practically put you back in time.
It would be nice to see steam power, though. We do see the steam donkey in the game.
There is one evident of that with the picture of the boat for episode
Steamboat.
5. There is steam test. The
oh yeah, you're talking about in episode. Yeah, the teaser for episode 5. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
It is a steam powered boat. So
it's an everything powered boat by the looks of it. Wind, steam, and maybe Aurora.
We'd all go back in time. It'd be like a time day.
And then couple that with the changes to the environment and nature. We have to relearn the patterns of nature because they're completely broken. We're gonna have to learn the migration patterns all over again and figure out the different changes that are occurring between each animal.
And it would become a survival of the fittest over again, because not the entire population would be able to survive this kind of, cataclysm. There's going to be, mass famines and things of that nature. So it's going to be a very ugly world to live in, a very difficult world to live in. Trying to keep up with the chat.
Creeper the drone. Also, the Blackrock prison heating system is steam driven, right? Yes, it is.
Yes.
I don't know how it works. I tried to do some research into it, how steam tunnels work, but yeah, it's steam driven. I just don't know what actually powers that,
And it does date the prison to the time that it was built.
In
that's
the 20s.
Yeah. Automobiles and all that would have been new. Diesel power would have been not very reliable, but at that time, steam was at its highlight. So very reliable.
Yep. And Creeper is also asking, could they possibly have had big storage of hay for the horses? So hay will eventually mold.
Yeah.
So even if they did have storage, it would eventually mold. And if you're working horses, like riding them and using them to pull stuff, hay is not going to sustain them alone. They need some sort of grain. You can also keep grain for a very long time in an airtight container, but that would be, again, whenever you're having snow and stuff like that, the humidity and the dampness, you're going to have a really hard time keeping mold away from hay and grain.
And you'd have to plan for that.
Yeah.
This happened all of a sudden, so
yeah,
there wouldn't be a lot of plans for that. So you'd have to, that's where it's going to be interesting with Black Frost, is to see they actually have these horses and all this stuff. At some point they figured out they needed to prepare for winter, and we may see that in some kind of a prelogue or sort of a step up or whatever. But yeah, there's got to be some explanation as to why they're able to keep horses.
That reminds me of the Pleasant Valley farms. They had hay bales still out in the fields.
Yeah,
and that wasn't because of the first flare. There's buffer memory that says they were caught by an early blizzard, and so they couldn't get the hay out of the fields.
Yeah, because
it's still there in game.
Yeah, because after you cut the hay like that and you put it in those big round bales, you actually leave it out to dry.
Yeah.
So you have to leave it for a certain period of time. And yeah, if that early blizzard came in, then you pretty much lost.
That helps date those buffer memories. It's really helpful, because if the hay bales are still there in game, that means those buffer memories are fresh, like a few weeks prior to the first flare. The Pleasant Valley buffer memories are really, really interesting. It tells you, it gives you explanation for why the valley is in that state. Like the hay bales are still out. There's an avalanche that blocks the main road. Those happen right before the first flare. And I go over that in some videos.
Yeah.
I love the Pleasant Valley lore. It's very good, very interesting.
It was a very active place for the people that were there. And again, that's that whole surprise thing. Nobody knew this was coming with the flare.
Yeah.
They knew that there were earthquakes. They knew there were dangers and stuff. And there was like the local, farmers market and what have you. That was the families that were still there trying to keep things going. And then the flare was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I would say the collapse was the straw that broke the camel's back. Then there's a rock. That would be the flare.
Yeah, that would crush
the rock would crush the poor camel.
That's probably a better way to put it.
Mm-hmm. I'm very excited for the horse aspect of Black Frost.
Same.
It's good. I'm interested to see how they're gonna do it. Are they gonna go like somewhat realistic, or are they gonna just kind of because game it? Like, just have fun with it. You just need to feed it every so often, and that's it.
Yeah.
Hope they can't die. Oh, that would suck.
That'd be
so sad.
Can you imagine being very far away from town and you're like stuck somewhere, and then the horse dies from being cold?
Yeah.
It'd be Luke on Hoth all over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Going through the chat here, see if there's any more questions.
I'll be the one is asking, do you have any advice predicting the weather?
In game? In the Long Dark?
Yeah, I guess so.
So this was, I think it was Bashrobe's video about some myths about the Long Dark, and I didn't know about this, about the crows that will sometimes spawn in and fly over. When you see those crows that fly above you, those only happen when a certain weather condition has been met, and it's like every so often. If you see them flying over, that means that it will remain clear. I think at the very least clear, maybe foggy, and not too much wind. Once there's too much wind and it starts blizzarding, those crows disappear. So if you haven't seen crows in a while, that may indicate that the weather is going to change. But it's not, it's not the crows actually doing that. It's the crows require a specific weather condition, and they usually favor clear, not windy conditions.
Yeah, I think Zach did a lot of testing on that as well.
Yeah,
I remember him doing a video.
If you're seeing crows flying above you, that's a good sign. But once they stop spawning overhead, you might want to find shelter fast. I mean, I would run as soon as you start seeing visibility drop quickly. You can tell from a distance usually. Start looking for the closest shelter and just make your way towards it. Especially in like the muskeg. The muskeg is very dangerous if it becomes foggy. You gotta start turning towards the closest shelter, even if it's like a snow shelter. Start making your way towards it. But yeah, the birds are very helpful. And then the drop in visibility is also helpful because that may indicate a storm is coming or fog.
Yeah, I've noticed that. Like if you get snow, and even if it just seems like regular snow, if your visibility starts to go from pretty far, that typically means that there's a blizzard rolling in, because it can actually take a while for a blizzard to trigger. Like it's very slow actually. So
it's also a good time to find a point in line of sight and walk in that direction. So you don't get lost in a blizzard.
Any more questions? And also, how much longer did we want to go?
Well, we're over by almost 25 minutes, so an hour and a half is usually our longest deal. But I know we had a little bit of a hiccup in the beginning, and I was kind of just letting chat drive the last part of this because I didn't really want to go into Wintermute. I think we should save that for part 2, and because there's going to be a lot to talk about, and that'll give Jitwire some time to finish because she didn't get all her homework done.
Yeah, I didn't get all my homework done. It was a bit much.
So for transparency, when we first started talking to Toasty about this, we both admitted that we hadn't finished the story, and so he gave us homework, and so I managed to barely get through the homework, but I probably need to go back and look at a few things because I kind of was rushing the last part of it a little bit. But
yeah, that was my problem. I was taking my time, though. My problem was the opposite. I was taking my time trying to find everything. So I'm like, oh, I can talk about this.
So, get Creeper the Drone. Yes, we were discussing whether or not this was going to be something we could do in 1 or 2 parts, or even 3 parts for that matter. And I've said this before with Zach, and that anytime Toasty wants to come on and join the table, we would love to have you here. And I hope Jitwire agrees with that. But we definitely want to be community oriented. So if you see on our schedule something that you want to, put your 2 cents in, by all stretch of the means, just let us know, and we'll pull a chair up at the table here, and we'll do the same thing again. This isn't a vanity project by any stretch of the means. We love having people on and talk and stuff, and I'm excited about a few people we've got coming in the future too. So yeah, by all means. So what you need to do now is you need to go comment on the bottom of the stream here and say you want part 2, and we'll talk Toasty into it.
Yep. Might also take a while to maybe get the recording up. I think it might be good to pull the old one and this one and see if I can somehow stitch them together. Yeah.
Discuss Methuselah. We'll get to that.
I think that's a episode 1 Wintermute discussion.
And 2, yeah. Part 2, so please. Part 3 when.
We'll have Toasty on again, and we'll start with Wintermute. We'll start at the beginning, and if it takes an hour and a half and all we've gotten through is part 1, then it'll be an ongoing series.
Part 2, 3, 4, please.
We'll do whatever we'll do whatever we got to do. So we love doing this. So,
and I know what your thumbnail should be. I have an idea in mind, but it's up to you to choose.
Oh, by all means, I like good ideas.
I'll share it after this.
Okay. So unless you guys got any more questions that Toasty can answer, or maybe even Jitwire and I can throw at you, we'll get with Toasty about when we can do this again. Like I said, we've got actually another guest scheduled here in the next couple weeks, so we'll get schedules lined up here for him to have a return visit.
Yep.
Okay. I don't see the chat bopping away, so I guess we have fulfilled most of everybody's questions for now. So look forward to seeing part 2 sometime in the near future, where we will have our resident.
Oh no. What are they doing?
What are they doing? Orange plank. Yeah, I don't think that's going to work here.
No, that does not work here. Those are some sound commands that I have on my stream, so they can occasionally drop orange, which is a fart. I don't know why it's fart. I originally was like kind of like an inside joke thing, but I just kept it as fart. And clank
funny,
is a really loud. Yeah, it was a really loud, like, metal clank.
I think I've heard that when I've popped in on.
Yeah, probably.
I know what that is.
That's their favorite. It used to scare me every time because it was so loud, but I turned it down recently.
So I hate to disappoint you, but we didn't put any sound effects when we were setting up the podcast because we didn't want interruptions. So.
That one is my favorite, Math Piss. From episode 4, Math is telling Will, that pisses me off. But like yelling.
We'll have to come over and play with that.
I'm just steadily adding more of them, especially from the Long Dark, but like I want to add some other stuff. I like Fallout, I like Halo. I want to do some other games as well. Just some fun things for them to interact with on the stream, get a reaction from me.
Yeah, Fallout would be a good one. I like Fallout myself. So, in fact, we have something coming out for the channel. I don't know, in probably the next couple weeks of a co-optive survival game that Jitwire and I did recently. But I won't say anything more than that. That's just a teaser.
Yep.
So.
This is actually a good comment here. That casual Zach. In my first playthrough, I couldn't help but think Methuselah and Grey Mother were Will and Astrid, or Astrid and Will. It's actually the opposite for who you're comparing who to. Grey Mother is a reflection of Will. They have eerily similar stories. They face a tragedy and kind of have a mental breakdown due to the tragedy and end up getting divorced. And it's very intentional. They intentionally pair Will with Grey Mother to kind of throw Will on this path towards redemption and reconciliation with Astrid. It's kind of like each character has their own purpose. Like the side characters, they have a reason to be in the story. If you don't get it right away, maybe you just it might take a few playthroughs to figure it out. But Grey Mother is very much there to teach Will a lesson about reconciliation and show him his future. Like what's life going to be like for Will if he continues to wallow in his sadness, his loneliness. But yeah, and Methuselah is a whole can of worms. I wouldn't compare him to Will or Astrid in the same way you would compare Will and Grey Mother. But Methuselah has his purpose. We'll get to that. I'll get to it in episode when we talk about episode 2, because I think we could probably talk about it like in the episode 1 conversation as well.
Yeah, because depending Grey Mother shows up and stuff. Yeah,
depending on how much we break this up, like how many parts we do to this.
Yeah.
This podcast mini series, I guess.
It's going to be a mini series. There we go. You got it straight from the horse's mouth.
And then Elijah says,
so what we need to do is each chapter, each story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Elijah says, "Isn't Molly Astrid's Grey Mother?" Yes, but not quite the same way. Molly and Astrid are kind of opposites. Astrid's like another, they're very distinct women. They live different lifestyles. And Molly's kind of there to show Astrid, her life could have been very different had she gone, the traditional wife route in life. And Molly's, the things that happened to her, I don't want to say them because they could be triggering. Some things happened to her in her relationship with her husband that kind of leads to her being a murderer, more or less. She has a reason for it. I'm not justifying her reason for it, but it kind of helps to show Astrid the differences between her and Molly and how, communication is very key for a relationship. Whether if you're a man or a woman, doesn't matter, or non-binary, whatever. Communication is very important for your relationship with a person. And I think, Molly is kind of like Astrid's Grey Mother, but it's not reflection of Astrid, but more of like an opposite kind of. And she has a similar effect, kind of leading Astrid towards reconciliation with Will. It's a lot of these side characters are there for that reason. I think it's building up to when Will and Astrid inevitably reunite, and they will likely have their moment of, we need to talk, because we've both been through some stuff in the past, and we both been through a lot of stuff here in the apocalypse, and we need to reconcile in order to figure out the rest of our lives, whether if they stay together or not.
There is a deep story there because of, if you go into, they're both wearing their wedding rings, they both hold hands during the crash. There is a whole story along that whole thing. So
yeah. Oh, and I didn't mention trust, which is also something that Astrid would pick up on when talking with Molly. As they converse, they build trust with each other, even though they're not physically there next to each other. And it shows you that Astrid really did trust Will a lot, even though they had been separated for so long. and it's why she would eventually turn to him to
And that word
take
comes
her.
up a lot.
Yeah.
In
Trust
the whole
comes up
story
a
thing.
lot.
Trust comes up a lot.
Yeah, Grey Mother doesn't trust mainlanders for what they indirectly did to Great Bear Island following the collapse. Will eventually builds trust with her, and then the same with Molly and Astrid. They need to build trust.
Even saying you have to build trust with Sutherland. So trust is is an underlying theme throughout the whole thing.
And it used to be a part of Wintermute, the trust system in the Predux version. It's kind of a pillar of just life in general, but in the apocalypse, it's vital because it's a life or death situation.
Okay, well, I don't think anybody's got any other questions. We will definitely have Toasty on back for what will be part 1 of story 1 with
looking
the
forward
plane
to
crash and Will, and we'll get those things scheduled to the later date and what have you. So Toasty, thank you very much for being on with us today. It has been an absolute joy.
Yeah, thank you.
Same for me. I appreciate you having me.
It's been wonderful, and I'm hoping as we grow and we get a bigger audience and that we'll be able to have you back on as a regular person. I'd love
of course
that a lot. So with that said, I will say my goodbyes now. Thank you everyone for being here. Toasty, if you'd like to say anything, and we let Jitwire close out the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you for all the questions and for sitting here and listening to the lore of the game.
It's been great. Great. I've had a good time. But thank you so very much for joining us, everyone. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.